One of the most brutal and ruthless kings of England was Henry VIII, a man who during his almost 4 decades on the throne would sentence around 70,000 people inside of his kingdom to death. It's believed that 3% of the population were slaughtered during his time on the throne, and Henry VIII is most remembered for the fact he executed 2 of his wives inside of the Tower of London. He would also order some of the most horrific execution methods to be used upon prisoners who were known for committing serious crimes. But the Tudor monarch even changed his own laws inside of his lands to allow some terrifying execution methods to be used, and there was little that people could get away with across England at the time. There was a reason Henry VIII was so feared, but let's look at 5 of Henry VIII's most horrific and ruthless execution methods. As always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. One of the most horrific execution methods used across England throughout the centuries was hanged, drawn and quartered, and this was a multiple-stage execution method. This punishment was for those who were found guilty of high treason, but there were accounts of Henry VIII commuting the death sentence because of its barbarism for some high-profile people. With this execution method, it was said, first the prisoner was dragged behind a cart from their jail or prison to where the execution was to take place. Once there, the prisoner was hanged in the normal way, without a drop, to ensure that the neck was not broken, but they were cut down while still conscious. Their genitals were cut off, and the stomach was slit open. The intestines and heart were removed and burned before them. Other organs were torn out, and finally the head was cut off and the body cut into 4 quarters. The head and quarters were parboiled to prevent them rotting too quickly. They were then displayed upon the city's gates as a grim warning to all. However, the person could still be alive following their genitals being cut off and certain organs being pulled out and burned in front of them. But also this was a punishment only performed upon men, as women were usually hanged or burned. There were many people subject to this during Henry's reign, including even scores of monks and religious people, such as abbots. These were pious and quiet people. However, because they refused to accept the changes that the Tudor king brought to religion, and because they could not accept Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England, they were forced to be condemned to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Sites such as Tyburn became deadly sites, where each week many people were being brought to their deaths to be hanged, drawn and quartered. One specific execution method which was performed during the reign of Henry VIII was boiling alive. This was a horrific method of death, in which someone would be lowered in and out of a boiling pot or cauldron of liquid, and it was known to have been a horrific and sadistic ordeal. In 1531, Henry VIII passed a law that stated that those who had committed high treason and poisoned someone above their station and position were to be boiled alive. Specifically, it was the case of Richard Roos, the cook of Bishop John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, who was subjected to this. Roos was a man who had allegedly poisoned the pottage of John Fisher, and 2 people died in this incident, and these were poor people who had been collecting food and to dine with the bishop. But many were also affected, becoming very ill. But then Richard Roos was rounded up, and he was imprisoned inside of the Tower of London, and may have even been tortured on the rack. There were some accusations that King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, were behind the assassination plot, but Henry did not allow a trial of Roos to go ahead. Was this to protect the guilty monarch, who had many problems with Fisher? However, Roos was condemned by an Act of Attainder, despite claiming he had only put a laxative inside of the porridge as a joke. But he was then taken to his execution by boiling alive, and it was symbolic, as he was considered the poison being lowered in and out of the pot. One account of his execution says, "He roared mighty loud," says an old chronicle, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead, and other men and women did seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at work. This execution method made many people feel sick, and boiling alive was used very sparingly, as it was so harrowing, and it was said Roos was lowered in and out of the boiling cauldron 3 times when he then died. Beheading and the execution method of it is considered very strongly linked towards Henry VIII. This is because 2 of his wives and some of his closest friends lost their heads in this manner. One thing to consider is that execution by sword was incredibly rare during Henry's reign, as it was only really performed upon that of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn. Execution by sword was said to have been more reliable than using the axe, which was said to have been a less reliable way to go. The problems with the axe was that things could go very wrong. For example, during the execution of Thomas Cromwell, it took many different swings of the axe to take his head off, and often hair could get caught, and this could cause issue for the executioner. At Tower Hill, this was where execution by axe usually took place. Prisoners were held inside of the Tower of London, and they were then brought to Tower Hill, where they encountered the executioner. Thousands of people flocked to witness these executions, and because of this it was treated almost like a spectator sport. The two wives of Henry VIII, who lost their heads, suffered this using sword and axe inside the tower's walls, and this was said to have been a private execution, despite hundreds of people witnessing it. There were many high-profile people who were executed in this way, such as Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who had royal blood, who suffered many swings of the axe on the floor of the tower. But the axe and sword was notorious as an execution method. It has become synonymous with the king because of the profile of those who were condemned by it. Burning at the stake was seen as an execution method, which was used for those who were convicted of heresy or religious crimes. A number of men and women were subjected to this in the Tudor period, and it was usually carried out in town squares or within London at a place known as Smithfield. People would be burned on a huge and large fire, in which someone was tied to a stake. But one woman who was burned at the stake by Henry VIII was Anne Askew. She was implicated on religious charges due to being a radical heretic, and she was even tortured inside the Tower of London, being the only recorded woman to have been so. Anne Askew was racked until her bones and joints were almost plucked asunder, and she had been brutalised. The result of her torture meant that Anne was then forced to be carried to her execution, and she was then on a chair strapped to the execution stake, and the fire was lit around her. Anne was also burned that day alongside a number of other people, and the sight and smell of this execution method must have been truly horrifying and horrific. One other execution method used by King Henry VIII was a rare one, and this was actually drowning. This was performed upon a woman named Alice Tankerville and her husband. They were accused of stealing money from the king, and for this were locked up inside the Tower of London. But Alice Tankerville befriended and fell in love with one of her guards, and he helped her escape the tower, but this escape attempt lasted a mere matter of minutes before they were both arrested. The guard was subjected to the rack and was hanged in chains from the gates of the Tower of London. However, Alice Tankerville and her husband, who had been located and arrested, were then sentenced to be drowned in the River Thames. Alice Tankerville and her husband were chained at the low water mark next to the Tower of London, and then as the tide rose throughout the day, the pair were drowned and were left to contemplate their deaths over a matter of hours, which was truly horrific. This was almost a pirate's death, and people would be hanged at the low water mark for 3 days, for 3 different tides to confirm death, before they were then gibbeted at times too. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.